Welcome, scholars. This is your AP European History review for Unit 13 on the Cold War, the collapse of communism, and the rise of the European Union. We're starting here, I'm going down the review sheet, we're starting with the Cold War, and it's this period of ideological confrontation between the United States and its Western allies and the Soviet Union and its satellite communist nations in the Eastern Bloc. The policy of containment is just that, to contain the spread of communism. Stalin has liberated, quote unquote, Eastern Europe at the end of World War II from the Nazis, but he has liberated them for communism, and he imposes these satellite communist regimes across Eastern Europe. You should be familiar with what countries those are. And containment comes from an idea by George Kennan, who is an American diplomat in Moscow, who says the Soviets are dangerous, they're duplicitous, they only understand one thing, and that's military readiness to oppose any invasion of Western Europe. And this plays itself out in the creation of a military alliance called NATO, set up by the United States with the Canadians and most of the Western Europeans. And this brings American military bases into Europe as part of that defense, and the counterpart is the Warsaw Pact under the Soviet control. The Truman Doctrine is the policy of the United States to aid any country fighting insurrection by armed minorities, reference to communists, and $400 million goes to both Turkey and to Greece, which Greece has a civil war against the communists, a very bloody war which the Royalists do win. The Marshall Plan is also put forward under the Truman administration, like NATO and the Truman Doctrine. The Marshall Plan has two goals, and that is to help rebuild Western Europe. And this is in 1948. This is several years after the war. The Western Europeans are still impoverished. There's high unemployment. The communist parties in Free Italy and France are getting close to a quarter, third of the vote. And we're very alarmed at the appeal of communism in the Free West. So the idea here is to anchor these countries in our orbit in the free capitalist West, but also to rebuild. So it has a two-pronged goal. We do offer assistance to the Eastern Bloc nations, and they are forbidden to take any American money by the Soviets, who don't want their to be tempted by capitalists in the United States. The Soviets in 1948 are very alarmed that the Americans and the Brits and French are planning an independent currency for a coming free West Germany, and in anger and alarm they began what's called the Berlin blockade. They shut down the roads, they shut down the trains, they shut down the waterways into Berlin, which is sort of an island within the Eastern zone of occupation, and the response here is an airlift by the United States and the British for close to a year to feed the city of 2 million people that the Soviets are trying to starve into submission. The Soviet foreign policy in Europe after 1945 is not, I would argue, is not primarily communism, although it certainly is. The goal is to have a dependable, safe buffer state between the Soviet Union and the Germans, who had invaded Russia twice in the 20th century. Should be aware of the Soviet leaders, who's in charge when. Stalin all through World War II and afterwards. He is the leader of the Soviet Union until he dies in 1953, and under him you have in the West the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, the Berlin blockade and airlift, the development of the A-bomb by the Soviets 4 years after us in 1949. Khrushchev comes in afterwards, and Khrushchev's the guy who's going to invade Hungary in 1956. He's going to get the boot in 1963 for basically pulling the missiles out of Cuba. He's the guy who folds. He's going to be followed in 1963 by Leonid Brezhnev, who's a hardline communist. He's the guy who's going to invade Czechoslovakia in 1968. And then we have Mikhail Gorbachev, who is the last Soviet president, the last communist president, and he is going to renounce the Brezhnev Doctrine. He's going to allow free elections in Poland in 1989. He's going to allow the wall to fall in East Berlin without a Soviet response, and he's going to allow the whole system to unravel in what some people call the Outer Empire. Just note, between Brezhnev and Gorbachev, there are two leaders who are these octogenarians who last only a few years, and that would be Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, but they're not significant as far as any initiatives on their part. The secret speech of Khrushchev is very shocking for the rulers in the Presidium, which later becomes the Politburo in the Soviet Union, and that is he denounces Joseph Stalin. He denounces his cult of personality. He denounces his crimes against socialism, his brutality, his murders, his gulags, and Khrushchev sets up a policy of sort of lightening up, allowing some criticism, and he allows Alexander Solzhenitsyn to write his book One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is a criticism of the gulags, prison camps, and Khrushchev's goal is economically more consumer goods and more economic goods for the Soviet citizen, for the Soviet customer. Suez Crisis in 1956, Nasser, who's the president of Egypt, invades the Suez Canal, and this brings a retaliation. The Brits and the French parachute in. The French are involved here, and that Nasser is supporting rebels, the FLN in Algeria. So the Brits are getting their canal back. The French are helping the Brits, and the Israelis are involved in fighting the Egyptians because the Egyptians have blocked the Suez Canal and are blockading the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli ships. The outcome here is the Americans basically yank on the proverbial leash here. We are paying for the restoration, the rebuilding of these two countries' economies, and we're worried when the Soviets threaten to attack France and Great Britain, and we pull rank, and the Brits and French and the Israelis all leave. And this sort of symbolically shows the loss of really military power of Europe, and the United States and the Soviets are truly superpowers that are calling the shots around the world at this time. In 1948, the Brits are allowing free elections in India, and the leader of the Congress Party is Gandhi, and Ireland will also declare itself to be a republic. Contrast here is the French and their empire are losing over 100,000 men fighting to retain Algeria and Vietnam. In Vietnam, you have a disastrous defeat after 9 years at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Excuse. And the French will leave. There'll be a Geneva Accord dividing Vietnam temporarily and the promise of free elections, which never happened. But the French are out of Vietnam. The French fight also to hold on to Algeria. There's 1 million Pieds Noirs. These are the white settlers who will, most of them will flee Algeria after a referendum does allow Algeria to declare its independence, but not before bringing down the French government, creating a new, bringing a new constitution for the French, the Fifth Republic under Charles de Gaulle. The Harkis are the Algerian soldiers who do fight this losing war with the French. And again, the contrast here is the French are fighting very bloodily and losing tens and tens of thousands of men. And the Brits are allowing their very vast empire to kind of go its own way relatively peacefully. The two crises in '56 in Hungary, where the Hungarians are under Imre Nagy allowing free speech and free elections and saying they're pulling out of Warsaw Pact. This is happening at the same time the Brits and French and Israelis are invading Egypt. So the Hungarian revolution will be crushed by Warsaw Pact intervention with Soviet tanks and all. And our criticism of this is undermined by the continuing imperialism against the Egyptians by the French and the Brits. 1968, your review sheet says 1969, it's 1968. You have a similar situation in Czechoslovakia as you did 12 years earlier in Hungary, and that is you have the lightening up of the system here in what's called the Prague Spring. Alexander Dubček, the leader of the Czechs, is allowing free speech and free elections and political openness, and you have another invasion here by the Warsaw Pact. And the Brezhnev Doctrine refers to the policy of Leonid Brezhnev that no communist country will break out of the orbit of the Soviet Union. There will be no free speech, there will be no free elections, there will be no leaving the Warsaw Pact, and that's the official Soviet policy. In Poland, solidarity is this labor union which rises up in the shipyards at Gdansk. Leader is Lech Walesa, who previously obscure but becomes very famous. He is the leader of this economic protest, which later becomes a nationwide political rebellion against the communist system. And this leads to General Jaruzelski overthrowing the communist government. Kind of crazy thing here in a communist country. The Jaruzelski overthrows it to keep the communist system in place, because the fear is the Soviets again have moved tanks to the Polish border. And you should be familiar, and you saw the video 9 Days That Changed the World, which is about the rise of a Polish Pope. Karol Wojtyła is made John Paul II, and he's going to work spiritually to undermine this regime in the ensuing approximately a decade. The issues in Poland in 1980 are the same as in 1956. The riots, the protests are over lack of human freedom, but more specifically over high inflation and high prices for food and the lack of availability of consumer goods. What causes the Europeans to surrender their overseas colonies? Number of things: military weakness at the end of World War II, colonial demand for freedom, which supposedly is what the Western Europeans are standing for in the first place, lack of American support, effective colonial leaders, guys like Gandhi in India, all will lead to really within about 10 years after the war, Europeans will basically lose their empires overseas. In a contrast here, the AP asks sometimes for synthesis, asks you to compare something current with something past, what's similar or what's different. And one comparison would be back in a contrast actually, in 1885, you have the famous Berlin Conference where the European powers are meeting in Germany, and they are dividing on a map. They're pretty literally dividing up Africa and setting the terms of what counts as colonial occupation, and this is also called the Scramble for Africa. Reforms under Mikhail Gorbachev. He's the last of the Soviet presidents. The two terms you need to know are glasnost, which is political openness, and this will lead to elections within the Communist Party and then for non-communist parties to run, and the Soviet Union will collapse basically because of this freedom. And the purpose of Gorbachev is to bring reform, to bring the fulfillment of the promises of communism, but this basically works to unravel the whole system. And perestroika is the economic restructuring. And Gorbachev, again, will refuse to intervene when the outer empire sort of throws off its chains and goes its own way. And this is going to lead eventually to the 15 republics in the Soviet Union, all declaring their independence. And the Soviet Union, by 1991, will fall apart because there are no more pieces within the Soviet Union. So even the large Russia will pull out. And Boris Yeltsin will be the first freely elected president of a free Russia since Alexander Kerensky, in that short interim between the overthrow of the Tsar in 1917 and the fall of this same government under Lenin. Be aware the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift in 1948 are a different thing than the Berlin Wall, which was put up in 1961. And the whole purpose of this is East Germany is just hemorrhaging. About a fifth of the population has fled, many of them through West Berlin. If you can get to West Berlin, you can get out to West Germany. What preceded the building of the wall that made Kennedy seem weak is the botched invasion of Cuba in 1961 at the Bay of Pigs. The Soviets think that we're weak, and because we don't challenge the wall, the Soviets think we're really weak, and they stick missiles in Cuba in 1962, leading to the closest that we've come with the Soviets ever to nuclear war. And this, of course, leads to the quarantine and the Soviets pulling the missiles out and us agreeing to pull our missiles out of Turkey and not to invade the Castro regime. Détente is a term used to describe Richard Nixon's policy in the 70s of peaceful coexistence with both the Chinese, reopening up relations with them, but for our purposes in European history, it's a relaxation of tensions with the Soviets. A number of things happen. There's the exchange of sports teams and academic groups and trade delegations, and up in outer space, Skylab, our space project, and the Soyuz module are linking up, and astronauts and cosmonauts are shaking hands and doing experiments and eating food together. But the big thing is the SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which reduces the nuclear proliferation of weaponry between us and the Soviets. Some post-1991 Western provocations against Russia. Basically, one of the beefs that the current-day Russians have against the West is they have given freedom to Eastern Europe, and we have sort of encroached in that area. We have invited these nations to enter the NATO military alliance. So the Soviets now have a military alliance moving closer to their doorstep, but the Europeans have also brought in these former Warsaw Pact countries, and the Soviets feel there's a humiliation and some sense of potential military danger as this alliance moves eastward towards their borders. Just a little bit about the Korean War. The Korean War doesn't see tremendous European involvement. About 80% of the non-Korean soldiers fighting the war are Americans. This war is from 1950 to 53, but there are many tens of thousands of European soldiers involved due to a United Nations police action in defense of a United Nations state invaded by the North Korean communists. Israel was created in 1948 by the United Nations, and interestingly enough here, the Soviet Union supports the creation of Israel. Why? Because the government of Israel at this time is socialist, and the Soviets think that they will support Soviet opposition to British imperialism in the area. Israeli guerrillas will battle British troops in Palestine in the years after World War I, during the Mandate period, where the League of Nations gave this land taken from the Ottoman Turks after World War I to the Brits. So the Brits and the Israelis that are living in pre-independence Israel are having at it. So the Soviets think they have kind of a natural ally here against the British. 1979, under Brezhnev, Afghanistan is invaded, and the purpose here is to protect a communist government at the time in Afghanistan from being overthrown by Islamists. And this becomes sort of an equivalent of a Vietnam for the Soviets. For 10 years, they lose about 2,000 people a year to the Mujahideen, who are being armed by Americans, both with weaponry and with financing. Chechnya is an autonomous province, part of Russia, but kind of, you might want to think of sort of like an Indian reservation, although that's not quite the right analogy. But it's an independent, self-governing province that is wanting to declare its independence like these other pieces of the former Soviet Union. And Yeltsin and Putin are going to move Russian troops in to crush this rebellion at great civilian cost to the Chechnyan people. Nationalism's effect on the Soviet Union and on Yugoslavia and on Czechoslovakia, you should be aware that replacing communism as an issue in Europe, nationalism is an issue. 1990, all these pieces of the Soviet Union secede and pull out. Chechnyans have their own nationalism going on. In Czechoslovakia, in 1989, you have the Velvet Divorce, where the Slovaks, not to be confused with the Slovenes in Yugoslavia, the Slovaks break off from the Czech Republic, so now we have a Czech and a Slovak Republic. And in Yugoslavia, not too long after Joseph Tito's death, there is a breaking apart of Yugoslavia. The Slovenes declare their independence. The Serbs fail to keep them part of the Yugoslav nation. The Croats rebel, and there's a very bloody war involving hundreds of thousands of people on both sides being ethnically cleansed, being forced across the respective border. And the Croats, there's bad blood between them and the Serbs. The Croats were involved with the killing of about 300,000 Serbs during World War II. So you have this fighting between Serbs and Slovenes, Serbs and Croats, but the bloodiest fighting is in the state of Bosnia, which declares its independence. And the Serbs invade Bosnia, as do the Croats, because Bosnia is this mixture of Croats and Serbs and Bosnian Muslims. There's also an attack by the Serbs against their southern province of Kosovo, which is about 90% Albanian Muslim. So there's this huge death and destruction and a refugee crisis in the unraveling and the break apart of Yugoslavia. The Dayton Accords will bring an end to the fighting In Bosnia, you have your first NATO military action since the end of World War II in both Bosnia and later in Kosovo, forcing the Serbs to allow Bosnia and later Kosovo to get their independence. You should be able to sort of explain the sequence of European economic integration. Two purposes for economic integration. One is greater prosperity, to create kind of a super union of Europeans who are able to buy and sell and move goods freely, kind of like states are in the United States. But also, the idea is to, by creating shared economic prosperity, the Europeans who fought these two bloody wars in the 20th century will be very unlikely to go to war again, and that's worked wonderfully since 1945 in Western Europe. 1951, you have the European Coal and Steel Community. The 6 members that start this are the Benelux countries, the Luxembourgers, the Belgians, the Netherlanders, the French, Italians, and the West Germans. And the European Coal and Steel Community is what it sounds. It's the free exchange of coal and iron ore and the breaking down of customs barriers between these countries. This is 1951. The Treaty of Paris does this. 6 years later, 1957, the Treaty of Rome will set up the EEC, which will expand the free trade between a larger group of nations. And a nickname for the EEC is the Common Market. And the final culmination here of the EEC is going to be the EU, which is created by the Maastricht Treaty. This is a meeting in a small town in southern Netherlands in 1993 of a trade zone of 508 million people, potentially the richest trade zone in the world. The idea is free trade, free movement of goods. The Schengen Treaty in 1995, 2 years later, 26 of these EU countries abolished passport control. You can just go across borders without anybody checking you, asking you what you're doing or where you're going, sort of the free movement of people. In 2002, you have the creation of a common currency called the euro. The last thing here on the review sheet is be aware of Muslim attacks on Europe, as the Europeans have been involved in the 2 wars against Iraq, and as they've been involved in Afghanistan, and as millions of immigrants have moved over the decades into Europe, you have this large Muslim population with various reasons for alienation, and there's been continuing terrorism attacks in places like London, places like Madrid, in Paris, and most recently in Brussels. And we'll talk more about that, more about current demographics in Europe in Unit 14 on Europe in the 21st century. So here goes your review. Just a reminder, look over what you've been reading and underlining and highlighting in your textbook. Hopefully by now you all have a good review book. And look over the review sheet. Everything on it represents a question that will be on the test. Good luck. Signing out. See you on test day.